shifting from a job focus to a performance focus. And it's an interesting topic. And for those of you who don't know me, just a bit of background about me before we get underway, not too much, but enough. You can see that obviously I write books. So I'm an author. I've got 10 books. I'll have 10 books out by the end of this year. And of course, one of those is Winning Teams, the 8 characteristics of high-performing teams. You can see, of course, that I speak. So I do a lot of platform speaking. I do a lot of executive coaching. And I still play rugby in the Golden Oldies competition here in Brisbane, and we play every second week because it takes, at my age, 2 weeks to recover. So a little bit about me. All right, so I had some very nice feedback about my book, Winning Teams, from a number of legends who played the game of rugby, both here and in New Zealand. And of course, the book's very much based on some of the principles that the All Blacks have covered. So we've got some great testimonials there, as you can see, and also from the Police Commissioner, Katarina Carroll. So there's been some great feedback for the book so far. And Nick Farr-Jones, who was a winning Wallaby captain who won the World Cup many years ago, had a great testimonial for me in the book. So there were lots of good things, nice things that people wrote about the book, which was wonderful. Coming back to the topic of shifting from a job focus to a performance focus, you can see on your screen there in the book, pretty much the model that you can see on the right-hand side is in the book. So the 8 characteristics of high-performing teams run around the outside. You can see there's 8 characteristics there, ranging from building trust to learning continuously. Now, obviously, in our session today, we're only here for half an hour. I'm just going to cover one characteristic, and that's going to be, as you can see from the arrow there, be agile. So we're only going to talk about agility at this stage. And I'm going to suggest to you that by focusing on performance rather than on the job, you can increase agility. So I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. I mean, one of the objections that people have, and I talk to people all the time about this, is that they may feel uncomfortable discussing non-job roles with their team members. And the reason that they may feel uncomfortable is because, one, it's not in the job description. But more importantly, I think the reason that people feel uncomfortable is because they don't want to appear to be too subjective in their judgment. So, for example, if I'm talking to someone about whether they're a team player or not, it might seem that I'm being very judgmental. But I can assure you that these things are important to talk about. In fact, if you don't talk about it with your team members, what happens is they don't consider them to be important. In fact, they become so wedded on the job description that they forget that there's actually other things that they should be doing that aren't actually listed on the job description. So the idea is that we need to talk about non-job roles, and hopefully I can give you a little bit of confidence to do that today in the way I go about it. So that is a fair objection. And I think that this is the reason that team leaders and managers don't talk about non-job roles, because of the perception of subjectivity. Now, I'm going to talk pretty much about the job description to start with, and you know, a little bit about the job description. I wrote a book about and the book was called The End of the Job Description in 2015. And so that gives you some indication of what I think about job descriptions. And I'm going to talk about the 4 non-job roles that I that I mentioned, and these are the non-job roles that I think are universally applicable regardless of the industry. And of course, at the end, I've got a special offer for you, which I'll get to. Now, what happened, of course, was that the concept of scientific management occurred about 100 years ago and pretty much occurred on the Ford assembly line. And Frederick Taylor, who happened to be an engineer, decided to go into the Ford Motor Company, or was invited to go in. And what he did is he basically looked at each process in the assembly line and worked out what was the one best way to do each of these things. And once he'd worked that out with a stopwatch and all the rest of it, I'm sure you've heard this story, he then documented that. So basically anybody working on the Ford assembly line, scientific management really meant that they were to do that job, whether it was putting the tires on the car, or whether it was putting the roof on or putting the engine in, whatever it might be. What was required there was to do this in a certain way. In other words, the most efficient way possible. And that way, of course, it meant that costs were lowered, training was reduced, and it meant that more cars were produced ultimately, and the business did well. And of course, the business did do very well as a result of that. So scientific management's very important, because that's really the starting point of where this whole concept of job specification came in. And job specification, meaning specifying a particular job of what people have to do. That's where it all started. And from there, we basically ended up with 3 generations. And this is in my own words. This is from my book, The End of the Job Description. We ended up with 3 generations of job description. The first generation of job description, which pretty much came out of scientific management in the early part of the last century, was the idea that we would just list down on a piece of paper all the tasks required of each particular job holder. So the first job description was fairly primitive. And then what happened was around the 1950s, job competencies became important. So not only were the tasks listed, but also the actual competencies required for each task were also listed. And that's what I might refer to as the second generation job description. Now, I still think we're in that phase, and I think we're moving into a third phase now, which is the third generation job description, which is really now not only is it talking about the tasks, they're still in there when we call them key result areas. We're also talking about the competencies required to do the task, but we're now talking about the non-job roles. So it's only, I think, in terms of post-COVID, that this is the time where the third generation role description will take off, where non-job roles will be considered as critically important. In fact, I believe they're now getting to the stage where they're just as important as job roles. So my job is to share with you what they might look like. The trouble with the job description, as we all know, is it usually has a little disclaimer at the bottom that says, very similar to what's on your screen there on the left-hand side, you're required to complete any other duty not on the job description deemed relevant by your manager. And of course, that's a legal disclaimer, but it's the trouble with that, of course, is that what it's really saying in essence is that what we've written down in your job description, you're expected to do more. And therefore, we haven't or can't document everything that you need to do. And so what happens, of course, is we put this legal disclaimer down. And that, of course, we all are familiar with that. So I guess I'm pointing out that the job description is not a complete work document anyway, even though we'd like to think it is. So regardless of how well it's written, how well it's formatted, it's not necessarily a good document, well written. So, and if you think about the job description, it very much pervades nearly every single thing that we do in the workplace. For example, when we recruit somebody or when we select somebody for the job, what happens is that we refer to the job description and we ask questions around the related competencies around each of the key result areas. So the person that gets the job is actually the person who probably closely matches each of the criteria in the job description. So before we even get going, people are pretty much influenced by their job description. And then they're inducted into the business. And often what that means is that the manager will sit down and work with them to induct them, explain to them the various requirements of what's expected of them in their job. And then what happens is HR normally will give people an opportunity to, to be involved in training and development. So the idea is that people can go off to various training courses, and most of those training courses, as we know, are very much related to task specific or job specific type things. So in other words, the training and development is pretty much based on helping people become even more effective at the various tasks that they're required to do in their job. So again, the job description is pretty pervasive. And then when we remunerate people, we often justify the remuneration level based on whether people are meeting their KPIs. So again, the KPIs are part of the job description. And then what happens is that when we actually promote people, particularly into leadership roles, unfortunately, what we do is we do often promote people into those roles based on their mastery of the job description. So that's why we find that people who end up leaders are usually the most technically capable person in the team, which is not ideal. I'm sure you'd agree. But that's the reason it happens, because we have such a great reliance on the job description. And then, of course, we manage performance, and then what we do in the performance review is we refer to the job description. So what I'm doing is I'm painting a picture here of how incredibly powerful and important the job description is in our life. But I'm also wanting to argue that it's no longer, worthy of the same justification, because post-COVID, their non-job roles are critically important, and that's what I want to concentrate on right now. I would actually argue that the roles that people play in teams are more important than the jobs they do. Now, that might sound like a pretty big statement. I'm sure you would agree with me, but let me demonstrate to you what I mean by that. And I'm talking about the post-COVID environment. So let me show you some survey results that are very, very interesting. 9,000 managers were asked to identify what they most valued in terms of attributes of in employees. And these were the attributes, and I'll put them up on the screen. So the number one attribute, remember, there were 9,000 across 21 industries in several different countries. So it was a good comprehensive survey. And this is what managers wanted from people as employees in the workplace. So the number one attribute is they wanted people with a positive attitude. Number two on the list, they wanted good communication skills. Number three is they wanted people who were self-motivated and showed initiative. Number four, they wanted honesty. Number five, they wanted people who liked working with other people. Number six, they wanted persistence, stickability, if you like. Number seven, they wanted someone with the ability to work in a team. Number eight, they wanted good organizational skills and the ability to work under pressure or resilience. Number nine, they wanted someone who was willing to learn. And number 10, they wanted someone who's dedicated and dependable. Now, what's interesting about this list, I don't think it would surprise you. I mean, when you look at the list there, you'd say, well, yes, I can understand why a manager would want those attributes in an employee. What is actually interesting about that is there's nothing on the list that's actually a job skill. All of those things are what I might call non-job attributes. So these are things that people bring with them into the job. So I guess what I'm trying to illustrate by this research is to say this is, managers want people to have these non-job skills or non-job attributes. And they would argue, I think, that these things are critically important. And of course, we expect people to be qualified. We expect people to have we expect people to bring a certain experience with them. These are just a given, but these things here that you see in front of you are value adds. So I just wanted to illustrate how important that was. So now let's look at a model of this that I built up in my book, The End of the Job Description. So if you think about the work that people do, it's two-dimensional. At one extent, the work that people do is, of course, their job. That's, that comes out of their technical skills. So that part is understood. And the job description often does cover those areas quite well, particularly if it's well written. So that's only one dimension. I wanted to share with you the other dimension. The other dimension of performance is really what I would call non-job tasks. Okay, so now this isn't new. The non-job task concept isn't new. It's been around for about 20 years, and scholars have been trying to work out, is there a set of non-job tasks or skills that is actually applicable across all industries? And they've been debating that for a long time. And I decided that I'm just going to work this out and find out what the top 4 were, and I'm going to identify them here today. And I would suggest to you that if you think about your team, I'll guarantee that these 4 non-job roles are critically important to your team's success. The first non-job role that I think is critically important to a person working in a team is to have a positive attitude and show enthusiasm. I don't expect people come to work bouncing off the wall with excitement. That's not what I'm suggesting. But what I don't think people should do is come to work whinging and complaining and passing the buck and not taking responsibility. We all know that these things happen all the time. And the law of averages is you've probably got someone in your team doing that. Obviously, this is critically important for lifting morale, and a person's attitude is infectious, as we know. And so it's not written on the job description, but I would argue that it's critically important to success. And so I put that down as one of the 4 that I think is really important. Another one that I think is very, very important is the team role. I think it's true to say, and COVID certainly brought this out, that working in teams now is critically important. It is, in fact, the number 1 structural building block of organizations. So we expect people to be able to work in teams. And yet you'll find people often will say, as long as I'm doing what's on my job description, it doesn't really matter that I'm not a team player. Well, it actually does. And I believe it's a critically important non-job role that's applicable right across all industries and not just 1 or 2. Another dimension that I think is critically important is the career role. Now, what I mean by the career role here is that I believe that people should be continually upgrading and developing their skills. In other words, to be a lifelong learner. I think it's in their interests, and I think it's also in the interests of you as the team leader. So if you've got someone who's continually improving and developing their skill set over a period of time, they're obviously going to be an asset to your team. But not only that, they will also be doing a lot for their own employability, because obviously if someone stops growing, you find that, that they'll be going backwards because the world is moving so quickly in one direction. But again, how often do you find people saying, look, I'm not comfortable using this new system or process. I've been using what I've been using here for a long time. I'm very comfortable using it. Or they might say something like, I'm too old to go to training, send somebody else. You hear this sort of thing all the time, and it's quite damaging, not just to the individual, because after all, they want to be employable, but it's also damaging to the team because it means that that person's not growing and developing continuously. So I believe that's a very important 3rd role that we need to consider in the whole process. So those are 3 roles. And the 4th role that I believe is critically important, particularly now that we're in the 21st century, is the innovation and continuous improvement role. In the last century, the person who was the team leader, and that's you were the one required to come up with the good ideas. You were the one required to look after the efficiencies and effectiveness of the team. Some of your team members still might think that that's your job, but I would argue that it's everybody's job who's in a team. I want people to come to work and not leave their brains in a paper bag at the doorway. I want them to think about how we can make our workplace more efficient and effective. And I believe it's a very important non-job role, because let's face it, as team leaders, we don't have all the good ideas, do we? Or we might think we do, but we don't. So therefore, we want people who are innovative and continuously improving, and that's very, very important. So that becomes critically important as a fourth non-job role. I have no doubts there are other non-job roles that are critically important to people's success at work. But what I'm sharing with you are four, and what I'd be challenging you to do is to have the conversations around these four using critical incidents. So in other words, look for examples in the workplace where you can talk about these things. Because they're not usually listed on the job description, they're the things that aren't talked about. And because they're not talked about, then people don't think they're that important. But imagine if you had a team of highly technically trained people and all of them had a terrible attitude, all of them were individuals and not team players, all of them had stopped growing and learning, and all of them did not offer any suggestions of how they could make the workplace more efficient and effective. I would imagine that that wouldn't be a productive team. I'm sure you'd agree. All right. So, folks, that's it from me on that side of things. I just want you to be aware that next Friday, I have one of these free webinars every Friday. So you are most welcome to join, and you've got the link in front of you there. So when I send out the email to you, you'll get these slides and you'll be able to click into next week. And I'm going to be talking about developing a team values charter, which is an excellent tool to develop those non-job roles that we've been talking about. And so that'll be Friday from 10 to 10:30, same time in exactly a week's time. More than welcome. And in fact, I have one every Friday. So tune in, and I'm just throwing half an hour gems. Hopefully they're gems for you, so you can take away and work with something and not consume too much time. The other thing I'd like to say is that if you haven't purchased my book, it is available. And because you've attended today, I'm going to give you a special offer. Normally the book is $35. Today, I'm going to give it to you for $25. And all you have to do is respond to the email when you get it, and you'll be given a special token. You can go in and get your discount, and you just have to go in and get that. So that would be great. So I'll finish up there. So thank you, everyone. I just have a comment here that, oh yes, I've just had a feedback that I was on mute earlier on. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Pauline. Yeah, we've got that. I'll remember next time, but it happens to the best of us. Well, look, we'll catch up next week, perhaps. Keep your eyes peeled for the email that'll be coming your way. And in that email, you'll get a copy of this recording, and you'll also get a copy of the slides, and take advantage of the discount and make sure you book up for next week when we talk about a team values charter. So that's pretty much it from me, folks. So I'll sign out at this point, and we'll catch up in perhaps a week. Thank you, everyone, and all the best, and goodbye.